weeks leading up to today, I had thought that I might spend this time during the sermon to reflect upon and tell you the story of John Napolitano. John was a firefighter in Rescue 1 who was killed when Tower Number 2 went down 10 years ago today. But as the time got closer and the media reflection on all this intensified, I started to change my direction and my emphasis. Because I realized that the fact of the matter is that not one of us was untouched by the events of that day. And every single one of us has a story to tell. It's good for us to tell our stories, to reflect upon the emotions, the feelings, where we were that day. It's good for us now to look at where life has come since this day and how it has affected us and where we are as we sit here today. But more important than our stories is reflecting upon and remembering God's consistent story in the midst of our lives and in the midst of our stories. As I prepared for this morning's sermon, I went back and I read the sermon that I had preached at the funeral of John Napolitano. As I read that sermon, I realized that it was October 1st, 2001, when the funeral took place. 3 weeks later, we were holding out hope that remains would be found. There were none. We had to schedule around all the other dignitaries who had so many other funerals to go to because that day was so tragic. But as I reviewed the sermon, I remembered that the theme and the words that I hoped to use to bring comfort to John's family and his friends as they mourned his loss that day, that theme actually came from John's own words. He would sign every card that he would send to a loved one. Right before he put his name down, he would say, "May the Lord hold you in the hollow of your hands." It was that theme that formed the backdrop for the words that I hope to use to help that family get through that difficult tragedy, get through that experience they never in a million years would have thought would have happened to them in their lives. And that theme, that the Lord holds us in the hollow of his hands, continues to be what sustains us 10 years later in the midst of whatever difficult circumstance and tragedy that may befall us. Now I think that this 10th anniversary may offer to us an additional blessing that we may not have had in past anniversaries of this event. I think now enough time has moved along that now maybe we can see things with a little bit different perspective. I hope that as the world has moved on, as time has moved on, that you have been able to find some healing for some of the scars, some of the trauma that you experienced on that day. I hope that as you look at the way the world has moved on, you are comforted by that theme, the hands of God holding us. I mean, as we look at the physical places where the attacks took place, many of them are rebuilt or in the process of being rebuilt and should be done soon. The memorial is finally done, giving an eternal tribute to all those who were lost that day, all those who sacrificed their lives. We know as we look around that many of the skirmishes and battles that started as a result of that day are winding down. Osama bin Laden no longer is a threat on the face of the earth. And even more surprising and probably miraculous is how we can see in certain places in the Middle East where we would have never imagined how the groans for peace and freedom are getting louder and louder. But those feelings and those emotions weren't always so clear, and they weren't always so neat. At those times in our lives when we feel such pain, where we can't make sense out of things, when we are hurting in such a horrible way, sometimes it leads to words and actions that aren't so helpful, aren't so good. And I think if we look back and we remember, we can recall many different words or actions that were carried out in revenge or out of those emotions or out of that anger that really didn't help to move the process forward towards healing. And left untouched by the grace and the mercy of God, those types of emotions and feelings can become all-consuming and they can become self-destructive. That's why it's so necessary and important for us as we live the story of our lives with everything that entails it, that we constantly hear that story that God offers for us, that he holds us in the hollow of his hands. Because every single day, somebody experiences a September 11th type of event in their lives. The emotions, the pain, the anger, the fear and uncertainty that we experienced collectively as a country 10 years ago, somebody goes through each day when they get some sort of unexpected news or some sort of unfair tragedy that strikes them in their lives. The doctor looking and delivering the news of terminal cancer. A police officer knocking on the door to give the news that somebody had tragically died. The spouse that sits across a table and gives the words that a marriage is over. Each of these are an attack on who we are and how we live. And in the midst of those terrible, tragic situations, we look for hope. We look for some sort of comfort. We look for words that are going to be said to us that are going to assure us we're going to be okay, we're going to get through this. And as we look back today, 10 years later, I hope we can see that the hand of God was at work bringing us through that tragic and terrible day, bringing us to where we are today, because that hand of God promises to always hold us, to get us through those difficult and challenging times. The readings for today, which are appointed on our lectionary, they weren't chosen because of September 11th. This is what it was going to be a long time ago. But each of those readings offer us some powerful words of comfort and assurance to remind us that God holds us in the hollow of his hands. In the Old Testament reading, we heard the aftermath of the story of Joseph. And if you remember Joseph's story, Joseph, because of the jealousy, hatred, whatever it may have been of his brothers cruelly got rid of him, sold him into slavery, put him in this very painful and stressful situation. It was not God who did this to Joseph. It was the hatred and anger of man. Sounds familiar, right? But as we hear the story today, we hear it many, many years later, and we have a different perspective. We hear how God worked through this horrible, horrible circumstance in Joseph's life to bring about great, great good. We hear how because Joseph was a slave and then he moves up and he comes into this very special position, how now not only does he save his brothers and their families, but many other people too. Can we not 10 years later see how God has brought hope out of that tragedy? How he's brought healing out of hurt, how he's brought life and rebuilding out of death and destruction. In the reading from Romans, St. Paul's writing to the church of Rome again, and this time there's a bit of a problem. He's chastising them because not only are they having an issue over their differences of race, but they're also fighting over their differences of how they practice their faith, how they worship, their spirituality. So he has to remind them it's not for them to judge each other in their differences. That's God's job alone. And he goes on to remind them of this because he wants them to remember where they come from, who they are. For none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. And he goes on to further emphasize, because Christ died and is living again, he is the Lord of both the dead and the living. A reminder of who owns us, what it's all about. That life goes beyond the limitations of this world. Life is so much more than the unexpected, unfair tragedies that plague us. And then in the gospel lesson, Jesus tells that parable of the unmerciful servant. And that parable contrasts the unlimited mercy and forgiveness of God with the imperfection and often the desire to get revenge that's part of our human nature. And it's a reminder to us that sometimes when we are in the midst of such strong emotions, such pain, such fear, sometimes we are tempted to be like that unmerciful servant, losing sight of the humongous debt that has been released from us, yet still seeking payback for just a minor debt that is owed to us. And this gospel lesson, it's a little hard to hear because it's filled with judgment, it's filled with consequences, it's a reminder to us of how important it is for us in Christian living to reflect the grace that God gives to us. But more importantly, the gospel lesson is another reminder and example to us of how great God's mercy and forgiveness is, and why we can be certain that He will be there for us at all times, especially in the midst of tragedy, holding us in the hollow of His hand. When I preached at firefighter John Napolitano's funeral, I chose the hymn of the day, "Lord, Take My Hand and Lead Me," the theme on our screen. And I chose it because I think it reflected beautifully the words that he spoke to his family over and over again, words that I was hoping and praying would help them get through this time. And the second stanza of that hymn reminds us, "Though the tempest rages, I need not fear. For you, the rock of ages, are always near. Close by my side abiding, I fear no foe. For with your hand to guide me, in peace I go." That's the message that God consistently gives to us every single time we gather together as His children around these gifts. That's the message that sustains us and gives us hope in the most difficult of circumstances. That is the message that got us through the events of 10 years ago, and that is the message that God holds us in the hollow of His hands, that will sustain us for the rest of our earthly days and right through eternity. Amen.